Viewer discretion is advised.
Gore's made his money in the financial industry, shocker, founding Platinum Equity in 1995. He bought the Pistons in 2011 and they have been rebuilding every year since then. But I'm sure Blake Griffin and his stellar ability to shoot will solve all of their problems. What made you think that drafting Darko Milicic was a great idea? Oh look, he's big, he's tall, and European. Let's pass on D. Wade and Chris Bosh for him. Of course, you can never forget those looks of utter shock on the bad boys' faces when MJ finally figured out how to get past them. And that glorious night when your fans represented the D by setting off meta with one very accurate slinging of a drink. More on that later.
Dear residents of Detroit, we are writing to inform you that we are still actively looking for the Pistons. We understand things have gotten pretty bad, and if you have the time, please press F to pay respects to this once great team. Signed, the last decade of the playoffs. The Bucks at it again, running up the score like it helped their RPI rating, this time to the tune of a 59-point beatdown on the Pistons. Ernie Grunfeld dropped 27 points, Junior Bridgman added 24, and Kevin Restani had 22. It's not like these Bucks were good. They finished 38-44. Our second equine entry, Hooper is always up to something, from water skiing to throwing other mascots off buildings, you know, usual stuff. To me, he looks like Bullwinkle without his antlers.
Watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat.
Again?
I heard he tucked and ran during the Malice at the Palace to go eat some oats. The league's second youngest arena, the LCA has some amazing amenities and was so nice that the Pistons got extreme jealousy and left the Palace to come play in the new sandbox. As I have said in my NHL vid, the ceiling has LED lights, there are murals outside, and I'm positive you can get cheap pizza there that will give you terrible heartburn. If Stockton and Malone were dirty, the bad boys of Detroit took it higher than Elon Musk. But that's not their most cheatingest moment, as molesting people is just a strategy. The Pistons get the most out of their players by hazing them, like when they duct taped Spencer Dinwiddie to a chair and ran him under a cold shower. Luckily, Dinwiddie could take it and didn't sue the team. Thank God you finally traded Reggie Jackson after 5.5 seasons of apparently not realizing he was on your team. This squad is so hopeless that Blake Griffin is using this time off to transition full-time to comedy, and he's about as funny as Joe Dumars' tenure as GM.
Mouth guard. Looking out for me. A silicone shield? That what you be.
Of course, nothing is more perplexing than signing Boban Marjanovic and John Lure to a combined $62 million when you already had Aaron Baines and Andre Drummond, who, like a roll of film, never developed. A place associated with either beating up opponents literally, figuratively, or physically, and despite its rhyming with the word malice, the Palace never sold out its good name to a corporate sponsor. Though the WWE could have named this place and nobody would have been shocked. The Palace became obsolete in 2017 when the Pistons moved into Little Caesars Arena. Demolition was recently completed on the building, and the land has been slated to become a mixed-use office park. I wonder if you can pay to have a cubicle be on the exact spot Ron Artest punched a fan in his face. Ford Field and Little Caesars Arena, Detroit, Michigan. Neither of these two stadiums individually break the bank, nor have an outrageous percentage of public funds used, at about 1/3 the cost each being made up by taxpayer dollars. However, the total bill combined, $574 million, is pretty staggering considering Detroit has been teetering on bankruptcy for years. And those funds could be used on, you know, infrastructure or schools where a lot of the money was originally earmarked. I guess Detroit needs their sports teams, otherwise the place could get more depressing.
Hooper, Detroit. Hooper is a horse. Get it? Like a piston? Horsepower? Oh, I need another job. Anyway, it's another mascot who serves its purpose, I guess, but doesn't really have any qualities that make it memorable. Rating 5 out of 10. Detroit Pistons, Isaiah Thomas. When it comes to Zeke, there seems to be a disconnect between how the people who watched him play feel about him and what the analytics say. People who watched him or played against him swear by him and say he's a top 2 or 3 point guard ever, while the analytics say he was a very good point guard for a few years before tapering off in his 30s. Regardless of where you fall on the Zeke scale, nobody can deny he's the best Piston of all time. He led the Bad Boys to 2 rings and won a Finals MVP in the process. He also most likely should have won a 3rd title in 1988 as well, if not for a phantom call late in Game 6 of the Finals. Personally, I like Zeke because he pisses off Michael Jordan, and it's easy to see why, since Zeke's teams had a 3-1 record against MJ's Bulls in the playoffs. Thanks. Right, Pistons, Darko Milicic. Speaking of early 2000s European players who were drafted way too highly due to hearsay and teams being desperate to find the next Dirk, Darko Milicic famously went 2nd overall to Detroit in 2003, ahead of Hall of Famers like Dwayne Wade, Carmelo Anthony, and Chris Bosh. As we all know, Darko barely played as Detroit ascended into becoming champions in spite of their wasted draft pick. Darko lasted just 2.5 seasons in Detroit before finally being traded. He scored just 152 points on 174 shot attempts with Detroit and will forever be known as one of the biggest bust out Pistons. The Pistons haven't been good for 15 years, so let's go back in time to their glory years. Pistons fans act like Bill Laimbeer and Dennis Rodman were out there shooting rocket launchers and stabbing people with machetes in the late 80s when they weren't. If the bad boy Pistons played in today's league, they would get demolished. Isaiah Thomas is considered an all-time great despite only having like 2 or 3 legitimately great years and being washed up before turning 30. He was also accused of sexual harassment, while fellow franchise hero and 2004 Finals MVP Chauncey Billups was accused of sexual assault. Fuck this team.
On June 15th, 2004, the Detroit Pistons rode their suffocating, relentless defense to a championship for the 3rd time in franchise history, capping a winding journey back to the NBA mountaintop. After they'd gone 10 straight seasons failing to win a single playoff series, President of Basketball Operations Joe Dumars hired Rick Carlisle as coach in 2001. In his first year, they got off the schneid with a playoff series win over the Raptors, then traded Jerry Stackhouse for Wizards sharpshooter Richard Hamilton and signed free agent point guard Chauncey Billups. The next season, they won 2 series, earning a berth in the 2003 Eastern Conference Finals. But they were swept by the Nets, and with Larry Brown available, Dumars fired Carlisle to bring in the former 76ers coach. Brown would elevate second-year string bean Tayshaun Prince to the starting lineup to replace Michael Curry, and he proved to be an immediate defensive stopper. Then down low was the Fro, Ben Wallace, the 2-time defending Defensive Player of the Year who terrorized anyone who dared to enter his paint.
Wheels, forces, by Ben.
At the trade deadline, they acquired fellow Wallace, Rasheed, fortifying a smothering, ferocious starting lineup. With Billups locking down point guards, Prince eliminating the opponent's top-scoring wing, and Big Ben anchoring everything inside, the 04 Pistons defense was off the charts. They held their opponent under 100 points in 78 of their 82 games, the most of all time. They'd survived the Jermaine O'Neal, Ron Artest Pacers in a 6-game slugfest to reach the 2004 NBA Finals, where the heavily favored Shaq, Kobe, Peyton, Malone Lakers awaited them. The Pistons weren't intimidated and took that star-studded team behind the woodshed. And they did it by adopting the personality of the city where they played, with a roster of blue-collar, selfless, very good players that lacked a true superstar who'd get all the credit. This team worked together and shared the glory together, with each piece perfectly complementing one another. The next year, they returned mostly the same core, though they replaced backup big Mehmet Okur with Antonio McDyess. But just 8 games into their championship defense, in the first Pistons-Pacers matchup since their heavyweight bout of a playoff clash less than 6 months earlier, Ben Wallace and Ron Artest got into a scuffle with Detroit down big late in the game, and a massive brouhaha ensued when a fan tossed a drink on Artest.
He's absolutely out of his mind. This is the ugliest scene you'll ever see.
Wallace was suspended 6 games for his role in the malice at the Palace, a key reason for their slow 12-12 start to the season. But they rebounded and again returned to the NBA Finals to face Greg Popovich, Tim Duncan, and the San Antonio Spurs. They each held serve at home through 4 games, and with under 10 seconds to play in overtime of Game 5, the Pistons were primed to take a 3-2 lead. But then Rasheed Wallace helped off of Big Shot Bob Horry, and they don't call him Big Shot Bob for nothing.
Oh, unbelievable! This guy is off the charts.
That one flubbed rotation turned what was looking like a potential dynasty into a team that in a few years wouldn't even be able to tread water. Upon losing that heartbreaking 7-game NBA Finals in 2005, Pistons management had grown weary of Brown's wandering eye for other gigs as well as his ever-present health concerns, and the two sides parted ways after 2 seasons and 31 playoff wins. In stepped Flip Saunders, who won 37 of his first 42 games as their head coach en route to a franchise record 64 wins, while 80% of their starting lineup were All-Stars. Sorry, Tayshaun. Their 4th straight trip to the Eastern Conference Finals failed to yield a 3rd straight trip to the NBA Finals, however, as the Heat exacted some revenge from the prior year, with Dwayne Wade and new pal Shaq just too much to handle. The 2006 offseason would deal them a tough blow, as Ben Wallace, who'd monopolized the Defensive Player of the Year award with 4 trophies in the previous 5 seasons, signed with the Bulls in free agency. They replaced him by signing Nazr Mohammed before scooping up Michigan man Chris Webber after he was bought out in Philly. They made yet another conference finals, which they kicked off with a couple 79-76 wins before finding themselves knotted up at 2 games apiece against LeBron James and a bunch of flotsam riding his coattails known as the Cavaliers. But in Game 5, from the comfort of their own palace, the Pistons' attempts at resistance against the 22-year-old James, in what would have been his senior year of college, proved futile. James scored his team's final 25 points, including a couple dunks in the final 30 seconds of regulation to will his team to overtime. It also included all 9 of his team's points in OT, followed by all 9 of his team's points in double OT. A crushing blow and a devastating loss that the Pistons couldn't recover from 2 days later, as Baby Bron was off to his first NBA Finals. And in that summer of 2007, a new super team was forming in the Eastern Conference, with Kevin Garnett and Ray Allen each traded to Boston to team up with Paul Pierce. The Pistons were still chugging along with the same core, though they didn't bring back Chris Webber, leading to increased roles for third-year youngsters Jason Maxiell and Amir Johnson. But despite making their 6th consecutive Eastern Finals, nothing mattered against that powerhouse in Eastern Massachusetts. Sure, a Game 4 Pistons win tied up the series, but that would be their last playoff victory for a long time. The Celtics took the last 2 games and the series, causing Dumars to fire Saunders for his team's complacency while putting his whole team on notice that everyone was on the trade block and that no one was a sacred cow because you lose that status when you lose for 3 straight years. Dumars hired his old teammate Michael Curry to coach the team, and Dumars wasn't playing about a drastic shakeup. November 3rd, 2008 became a day that represented a monumental fork in the road for the organization. Just 2 games into the season, both wins by the way, he traded 2004 Finals MVP, franchise legend, and fan favorite Chauncey Billups to Denver for the expiring contract of Allen Iverson, while simultaneously signing Rip Hamilton to a big money 3-year extension. Piston players were extremely shocked and disappointed by Billups' departure, and their first game after the stunning trade was against the Bobcats, coached by old friend Larry Brown. Brown knew the 2 point guards traded for one another quite well and eloquently equated it to trading Marilyn Monroe for Jane Russell. But Iverson quickly proved that to be an awful comparison, as he'd firmly entered the twilight of his career and had a miserable year. Without their longtime leader and floor general in Billups, Detroit started falling apart around the All-Star break, and it only got worse after Iverson aggravated a back injury, knocking him out for over a month. During this time, team owner Bill Davidson died, making an already tenuous time that much more unstable. When Iverson returned, it was to a reserve role, which he hated, remarking that he could perform his diminished role while carrying on his back some sort of truck for ants. Following their April 1st loss in Jersey, the 3rd game with this new arrangement, Iverson reached a boiling point, saying that he'd rather retire than keep coming off the bench. So that would be the last time he'd ever put on a Pistons jersey, with Dumars pulling the plug on the Iverson era. But this is the East, the land where mediocrity is rewarded. Their 39-43 record was still good enough to crash the postseason party as the 8th seed. But they just became a fly on LeBron's shoulder that he swatted away with 4 straight double-digit blowouts. So out went Curry and in came John Kuester, an assistant on their 04 championship squad. Surely that would do the trick to turn around the team's fortunes. Though any attempt to do so would have to come without the services of their top 2 bigs in Rasheed Wallace, who signed with the rival Celtics, and Antonio McDyess, who signed with the Spurs. But hey, they still had that copious amount of cap space which their fans had been salivating over, and was the one silver lining to the Billups trade. Dumars, in turn, chose to use it to sign Ben Gordon and Charlie Villanueva to huge deals that soaked up 1/3 of their entire cap. Along with Hamilton, they were drowning in outrageous deals given to a bunch of UConn Huskies. And with Rasheed now gone, you can't just give the fans 0 Wallaces after years of giving him 2 great ones. So to meet their Wallace quota, they brought back Ben for a second go-round in the Motor City ahead of the 09-10 season. Their roster was this weird mishmash of aging, banged up, over-the-hill vets from their title run, youngsters like Rodney Stuckey and rookie second-round pick Jonas Jerebko just trying to keep their head above water, and of course the underwhelming but overpriced free agent acquisitions coming off the bench. The result was a miserable, joyless 55-loss season, but at least it set them up with a great pick in the 2010 draft. It was their highest pick since burning the 2nd overall selection on Serbian teenager Darko Milicic 7 years earlier, instead of Dwayne Wade, Chris Bosh, or Carmelo Anthony, one of whom might be nice to have right now. This time, they burned the 7th pick on Georgetown center Greg Monroe, a couple spots before Paul George and Gordon Hayward came off the board. Later that summer, they continued their fascination with washed-up has-beens and brought Tracy McGrady on board the sinking ship. They again hemorrhaged losses in Kuester's 2nd season, and things reached a tipping point when Kuester and Hamilton, a couple weeks after getting yanked from the starting lineup, got into a heated altercation at practice in early 2011. Shortly thereafter, following a January 10th loss in Chicago, Kuester removed him from the rotation entirely for a couple months, which really pissed the team off, especially Wallace, who thought it was crazy for his short-handed squad to deactivate an all-star. Attempts to trade Hamilton failed to come together, and before a February 25th game in Philly, most of the team skipped pregame shoot-around in a mutiny against their head coach, who then only played the 6 guys that did show up. And when Kuester got ejected in the 2nd quarter of that game, the Pistons bench had a jolly old time laughing at him. When they wrapped up another 50-loss season, big changes swept through the entire organization in a weird, extended offseason thanks to the 2011 NBA lockout. First, Tom Gores bought the team from Davidson's widow on June 1st, 2011, with Kuester receiving his pink slip 4 days later. They'd landed the 8th overall pick in the draft, where now Dumars decided to shy away from UConn products and chose Brandon Knight, a man best known for having his soul ripped straight from his body by DeAndre Jordan in the middle of a basketball game.
Oh, what a monster jam by DeAndre Jordan!
One spot ahead of March Madness hero Kemba Walker. Klay Thompson and Kawhi Leonard also went a few picks later. In July, they settled on former Nets coach Lawrence Frank to replace Kuester. Fast forward to December 12th, still the offseason, the Pistons reached an agreement to pay Rip Hamilton $11 million to go away. The season finally kicked off at the end of the month, where Frank's squad was beaten like a crash test dummy by the rest of the league, dropping 20 of their first 24 games, the worst start in franchise history. At the end of another disappointing season, 37-year-old Ben Wallace called it a career. And as the 2012 draft approached, they attached what turned out to be a future top 10 pick to dump Ben Gordon's contract on Charlotte. 2 days later at the draft, they actually did well, replacing Wallace with UConn center Andre Drummond before scooping up Chris Middleton in the 2nd round. But they were yet again doomed by another terrible start, losing their first 8 games and digging themselves into a hole they couldn't get out of. With the team reeling in late January, Dumars traded away the final remaining player from their NBA Finals run, Tayshaun Prince, to Memphis in a 3-team deal that brought back Jose Calderon from Toronto. Another wasted season, another coaching change. In what would be Dumars' final offseason running the show, he canned Lawrence Frank, replacing him with former Sixers coach Mo Cheeks. In free agency, Dumars' last big deal was a $54 million contract given to Josh Smith, forming one of the wackiest lineups you'll ever see, with not one, not two, but 3 complete non-shooters, all starting and sharing the floor together for heavy minutes. It was a quest to destroy the very concept and essence of spacing a basketball court that set hoops back for decades. And while Dumars threw fans a bone by bringing back Chauncey Billups to let him play out the final year of his career in Detroit, the final trade Dumars ever executed was a disaster when he tossed in future All-Star Chris Middleton in a deal with the Bucks for Brandon Jennings. Midway through that 13-14 season, just 50 games into his tenure, Cheeks became the 8th coach fired by Dumars in his 14-year presidency. On April 14th, 2014, with 1 game remaining in their 5th straight season losing over 60% of their games, Dumars stepped down as Pistons president of basketball operations. The Pistons under Joe Dumars had built a wonderful roster of selfless, hardworking players who knew their roles, did their job, and worked in harmony with one another. They were blue-collar through and through, developing an ethos in which their time together became known as the going-to-work era. They became champions without a superstar, an unbelievable feat that we may never see again in an era of super teams. But then Dumars completely lost his touch. Ultimately, the glaring mismanagement of the draft and free agency, a polarizing trade of the heartbeat of their team, and constant coaching turnover, which sparked dysfunction and inner turmoil, were all a perfect storm of forces to ruin the marvelous thing they had going. They were turned into a laughingstock that's gone over a decade without winning a single playoff game, thanks to their devastating, yet spectacular, collapse.